The morning of my first wedding anniversary, my mother-in-law came into my kitchen before the sun was up. She did not knock. She never knocked. She set a covered dish on my table, looked at my face for a long moment, and said one sentence. "You know what today is?" Then she left. I stood in my own kitchen, alone, in the dark, with a dish I had not asked for, and a sentence I did not fully understand. I was 19 years old. I had been married for exactly 1 year. And I had no idea that the day ahead of me was not going to be a celebration. It was going to be an inspection. By nightfall, I would have done the thing that was expected of me. And then, because of a decision my husband made without ever asking me, because of a date and a bishop who thought he was being kind, I would have to do all of it again, twice in 1 year, twice in one autumn. And there was not one person in that entire county I could tell. Stay with me, because what an Amish wife is actually expected to do on her wedding anniversary is nothing like what you are picturing right now. There are no cards, there are no flowers, there is no dinner where somebody else does the dishes. And when I tell you what there is instead, when I tell you what I had to do twice, I think you are going to feel something sit down heavy in your chest and stay there. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I left a few years ago, and this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, is where I finally say the things my community would never allow me to say out loud. If you want to hear more hidden truths like this one, please subscribe and tap the like button and tell me in the comments, what do you think an Amish wedding anniversary looks like? Drop your city or country too. I read every single one. Now let me explain what is actually happening on that day because it took me years of therapy to understand the shape of it. The English world treats an anniversary as a reward. You survived a year. You get flowers. You get a card that somebody else wrote for you. You get one evening where you are the point of the evening. In my community, the anniversary was not a reward. It was an audit. There are 3 things an Amish wife is expected to do on her wedding anniversary, and not one of them is for her. The first is the Rechenschaft. That word means the giving of an account. On the anniversary, a wife is expected to sit with her husband, usually in the evening, usually with the lamp between them, and give an account of the year, not her feelings about the year, her performance in it, what she preserved, what she mended, what she wasted, where she fell short in Gelassenheit, the yielding, the submission of the self. And the word for the failure is Eigenwillen, own will, self-will, wanting anything at all for yourself. You are expected to name your own self-will out loud to the man you married, and you are expected to do it without crying, because crying is also a kind of self-will. The second is the Bericht, the report. The wife does not simply confess to her husband and have it end there. Her husband is expected to carry that account forward. To his mother, sometimes to the bishop's wife, sometimes to the deacon at the next church Sunday, never in detail, never in words you would recognize, but a phrase, a nod across a room. She is coming along. She is learning. She still struggles. You will never hear it said. You will only ever feel it land. The third thing is the part nobody outside will ever guess, and it is the one that broke me. On the anniversary, a wife is expected to renew her yielding in the marriage bed, not as celebration, as obedience. The anniversary night is not a night off. It is a night of proof. Proof that the household is whole, that the wife has not hardened, that the marriage is producing what a marriage is supposed to produce. And in my church district, if a year had passed and there was still no child, that night carried a weight I do not have gentle words for. Rechenschaft, Bericht, renewal, account, report, proof. Not one of those 3 has anything to do with love. I married Amos in late October, Tuesday. Amish weddings only happen on Tuesdays and Thursdays after the harvest. He was 24, I was 18. He was a good man in the way the community defines a good man. He worked, he did not drink, he did not raise his voice. He built our bed with his own hands, and he did not know what to do with me in it, and neither of us had ever been taught how to say so. The first year was hard in the ordinary way. I learned to cook for 2 instead of 11. I learned that a house can be so quiet you start talking to the stove just to hear something. And I learned, sometime around the spring, that I was not becoming pregnant, and that every woman in that district had already noticed, and that not one of them was ever going to say it to my face. They said it other ways. My mother-in-law brought me herbs and did not explain them. A woman at church put her hand flat on my stomach at a funeral and said nothing at all. At a quilting frolic, someone asked how my garden was coming, and 3 women looked up at once, and the room went quiet for exactly 1 second too long. That is how information moves in my world. Sideways, disguised as something else. So when the anniversary came and my mother-in-law set that dish on my table and said, "You know what today is," I understood exactly what she meant. She did not mean congratulations. She meant, show us. Here is what surprises people when I tell them this. Amos was not cruel. Amos was frightened. He had been carrying the same year I had been carrying, and no one had prepared him for it either. He was a grown man who could rebuild a hay rake in the dark and reset a broken fence post in February ground. And he had no idea what to do with a wife who was afraid of him. The Ordnung, the unwritten but binding code that governed every hour of our lives, told him exactly what to require of me. It never once told him how to comfort me. The information gap in an Amish marriage does not only silence the woman, it hollows out the man. That evening, after the animals, after the supper, after the dishes were dried and put up, we sat down at the kitchen table with the lamp between us, and I gave my account. I said I had been prideful about my bread. I said I had wanted a new dress when the old one was still serviceable. I said I had been slow to rise twice in the winter. I said I had been resentful. And then I stopped, because I heard the word come out of my own mouth, and I did not know what would happen to me next. Amos looked at the table for a long time, the clock on the wall, the horses shifting in the barn, his breathing. Then he said, "That is enough." And I did not know. I still do not know, all these years later, whether he meant that is enough confession or that is enough suffering, or whether he simply could not stand to hear one more word of it out of the mouth of the girl he had married. I have turned that sentence over for years. 2 men can say the same 3 words and mean opposite things, and in a world where nobody explains anything, you never find out which one you married. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are, so I wrote the rest down instead. Slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now, let me tell you why I had to do it twice, because here is what I have not told you yet. Amos and I were married in October, on a Tuesday in my parents' house before the bishop, with 300 people eating roast chicken and mashed potatoes and gravy thick as paste and choufle pie in my mother's kitchen. But that was not the only wedding Amos was supposed to have. 11 months earlier, he had been meant to marry another girl, Rebecca. It was announced in church. The date was set. The celery was already planted in her mother's garden, and if you know anything about our world, you know what celery in the garden means. And then Rebecca's father moved the whole family to a settlement in Indiana over a dispute about tractor tires. I want you to hear that sentence again, because it is the entire Amish world compressed into one line. A family was uprooted, a wedding was canceled, a young man's life was rearranged. Over tractor tires, Amos was left standing. And in our district, a man who has been announced and then unmarried carries a shadow that does not lift. People wonder what she saw in him. People wonder what she found out. So when Amos came to court me, he came fast, and he came with something to prove that had nothing to do with me at all. What I did not know, what I did not learn until our first anniversary, was that Amos had gone to the bishop before our wedding and asked him for something. He asked that our marriage be counted not from the day we stood up together in my parents' house, But from the day the church had first blessed his intention to marry, the old date, Rebecca's date, and the bishop, thinking he was being kind, thinking he was quietly covering a young man's shame, thinking he was doing a mercy, said yes. Which meant that our marriage had 2 anniversaries, the one the community counted in November, and the one we had actually lived in October. And a wife is expected to do the Rechenschaft on the anniversary. So I did it in October, at my own kitchen table, for my own husband. And then 3 weeks later, in November, on a date that belonged to a girl I had never met and never would, I did the whole thing again. The account, the report, the renewal, twice. Twice I sat with the lamp between us and named my own self-will out loud like a debt being read back to me. Twice I heard the horses shift in the barn while I said the word resentful and waited to find out what it would cost. Twice I climbed those stairs afterward knowing exactly what was expected of me in that room, and knowing that it was not being asked of me, it was being verified. And the second time, and I want to be very careful with what I say here, the second time was not for me, and it was not even for Amos. The second time I was standing in for a wedding that never happened. I was performing a marriage that was not mine, on a date that was not mine, to settle a shame that was not mine either. I do not have a word for what that does to a 19-year-old girl. I have looked for one for years. There is not one. Now, I am not going to sugarcoat this next part, because this is where it stops being my story and becomes something much bigger than me. My friend Sarah married at 20. Her anniversary came and went for 6 years. And every single one of those years she sat at that table and gave her account. And every single one of those years there was no child. And every single one of those years her account got a little longer. Because when the year has produced nothing, the wife is assumed to have withheld something, not her body, her yielding. 6 years of being asked once a year to explain herself for something her body was doing entirely without her permission. We talked about it exactly once, in her pantry, kneading bread, both of us keeping our voices down underneath the sound of our own hands. She would not look up at me. She said, "I have run out of sins, Martha. I make them up now, so there is something to say." I make them up now, so there is something to say. I have never forgotten it. A woman inventing her own failures so that the ritual would have something to eat. And this is the part I need you to sit with, because it is the whole thing. What happened to Sarah? What happened to me? What happened to nearly every woman I knew? Was not an accident, and it was not cruelty. It was a system. There is no official teaching anywhere that says a wife must renew herself in the bed on her anniversary. It is not written. You will not find it in any book. The Ordnung was never written down at all. That is the entire point of it. That is the genius of it. It lives in what the mothers do. It lives in what the mothers-in-law say at the door before sunrise. It lives in a covered dish set down on a table without one word of explanation. Control does not always look like a rule. Sometimes it looks like a woman who does not knock. I finally told Amos. It was years later, and it came out sideways, the way these things always do. We were at the table. The lamp was lit. I said, "Do you know what the second one felt like?" And he said, "The second what?" He did not know. He had never known. He had asked a bishop for a date, the way a man asks for a favor, and he had never once thought about what a date means to the person who has to live inside it. He had moved a number, and the number had landed on my body, and he had never turned around to look at where it fell. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them, and he said, "I did not think of you at all." And I need to tell you something that took me a very long time to be able to say. That was the most honest sentence of our entire marriage. He was not defending himself. He was not apologizing yet. He was simply, for the first time in his life, seeing it. We sat there a long while. The clock on the wall, the horses in the barn, the lamp throwing long shadows across the table between us. After I left, the cost came fast. Meidung, the shunning, letters returned unopened. My mother's silence on the telephone the one time I tried. My father's door closed, and in a therapist's office, A woman I had known for 6 weeks used a word I had never once heard spoken out loud in 19 years of my life. Consent. Not consent to marry. I had consented to marry him. Consent to be asked. Consent to be counted. Consent to have my own anniversary belong to me, and not to a girl in Indiana, and a bishop's kindness, and a young man's shame. She said, "Martha, you were never asked. Not once." Not once. In 4 words, she undid a decade. And underneath the relief, and underneath the grief, there was a third thing. And it took me months of sitting in that room before I could name it without being frightened of it. Rage, quiet, cold, enormous. Now, I will not stand here and tell you that world gave me nothing, because that would be a lie, and I did not leave in order to start lying. It gave me a community so deep it has a texture. It gave me a work ethic that has carried me through every hard year since I walked away from it. It gave me a faith, complicated, wounded, rebuilt, but real. When my grandmother died, 400 people came, and every single one of them brought food, and not one of them had to be asked. The English world has nothing like that. I have looked for it. I have not found it. And Amos was not a villain. Amos was a boy who was handed a household, and a wife and a code, and no instructions, and he did the only thing he had ever seen any man do. But there is no theology that requires a woman to give an accounting of her own soul, as though it were a ledger. There is no scripture that says a wife must prove her marriage every autumn like livestock walked out at auction. And there is no God I believe in now who would design a woman and then arrange her entire world so that the one sentence she is never permitted to say out loud is this one: "No, not tonight. I am tired. I am 19, and I am afraid." The anniversary was never about the year. It was about who the year belonged to. And it never belonged to me. Not once. Not either time. If you grew up in a place where your love was measured instead of celebrated, I see you. If you were ever made to explain yourself for something your body decided without asking your permission, I see you. If you have ever sat across a table from someone you married and given an account of yourself like a debtor at a bank, you were not failing. You were obeying. And obedience and love are not the same thing, no matter how many people in your life said those 2 words in the same breath. They told me an anniversary was a gift. It was an invoice. And I paid it twice. Leave me a comment. Tell me what part of this stayed with you. Tell me if you have ever had to perform something you were supposed to feel. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down, first comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.